So, hi everyone, welcome to the third and last panel of our conference. My name is Maggie Hinbest. I am AHGSA's Vice President. And for those who were not in attendance for our previous sessions, this conference will address questions around empathy as it relates to art practice, theory, and history. We're interested in exploring the role of arts in bridging the gap between feelings and actions regarding especially issues of gender, race, class, and ability. We're also concerned with the limits of empathy, what empathy can and cannot do with regards to reconciling discrimination and privilege. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the host institution of this symposium, Concordia University, is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which Concordia University sits. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to diverse populations of Indigenous and other peoples. I also want to acknowledge that the headquarters for Zoom, which is facilitating this gathering, occupies the Muwekma Ohlone territory, which is currently known as San Jose, California. Many of you are joining us today from other places across Turtle Island and around the world. I myself am joining from Vancouver, the traditional unceded territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I encourage you to acknowledge the traditional landowners and caretakers of the lands from which you join us today. We recognize the injustices that are a part of the colonial history of these places, and we respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community and beyond. We will be leaving the chat open for the next few minutes if you wish to share with other people or other attendees, your name, academic affiliation, or where you're tuning in from. However, once the presentations start, I believe we'll be closing the chat. So any questions you may have, you can send in the Q&A box, which we will filter through during the moderation period and afterward. This afternoon, we will have 3 presenters, followed by a Q&A, which is moderated by Serena Desaulniers. Serena is a second-year student in the Masters of Art History program at Concordia. Her research delves into themes of community, critical disability studies, and haptic interactions through textiles and digital environments. She has recently presented her paper, Cyborg Encounters, the Ableizing Capabilities of Embodying Disabling Avatars at ISAIA 2020, and has co-curated the project Connections, Community Engagement, and Digital Art for Concordia's Center for the Arts and Human Development. Welcome, Serena, and I will let you take over.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending today. I'm really excited to explain to you all the panelists that are going to be present today. First, we'll be listening to Allison Kalb, a master's student in the art history program at Université du Québec à Montréal. She will be exploring how effective and speculative storytelling can offer up the opportunity for experiential knowledge production in her presentation, Performing Empathy Through Gestures, Text, and Space in Joan, Jonas is Moving Off the Land Too. By looking at Jonas's 2019 piece, she's going to be considering the relationship between humans and non-humans in relation to aquatic life, contemplating how empathy is performed within installations, text, gestures, and spatial configurations as a means of developing a kinship between humans and oceanic non-humans. Afterwards, we will be listening to Mutual Aid and the Gallery, a continuance of empathetic awareness by Kalina, Nedelcheva, an artist, emerging curator, and current MFA student at Concordia University in Toronto. Prompted by the current digital landscape, which encourages an immobile and passive culture, which is now only emboldened by the COVID-19 pandemic, this presentation will explore how embodied gestures and allyship are performed in digital environments in relation to the galleries and artist-run centers, interrogating the impact of empathy within virtual spaces in times of crisis. The final presentation for this panel will be presented by Nicole Hidalgo Mcgregor, a media artist who explores themes of intersectional feminism through research creation methods in order to build new perception and interaction patterns. Her presentation, Explorations of Volumetric Cinema and Documentary, delves into how three-dimensional capture technique used within volumetric cinema can reach beyond the screen in a haptic manner as a result of film's texture, opening up an opportunity for spectator and subject to develop an empathetic connection. And then after that, we will be having the 20-minute Q&A period. I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Serena, for that introduction. Thank you also to all the organizers, the other panelists, and keynote speakers. I'm very grateful to be participating today. So let me just share my screen. Voila. All right. So as Serena said, my presentation will be attending to the performance and performativity of empathy in the multimedia installation Moving Off the Land 2 by the American video and performance artist Joan Jonas. So the installation was first presented in 2019 at Ocean Space in Venice, Italy. You have an installation view on the right. And the work actually served as the inaugural exhibition for this new interdisciplinary art center, a platform of the Thyssen-Bornemisza Art Contemporary Foundation, which is dedicated to catalyzing ocean literacy, research, and advocacy. The installation actually represents a spatialized iteration of Jonas's earlier performance lecture, Moving Off the Land, work that was also commissioned by the foundation for an interdisciplinary program held in Kochi, India in 2016, and this performance is ongoing, presented as late as, or as early as last year. So you have a performance view on the left here. So given their commission contexts, both forms of moving off the land reflect on themes of planetary ocean biodiversity and the entangled coexistence of human and non-human life forms. More specifically, the moving off the land pieces weave together a patchworked mythological storytelling of the common origin of human and ocean life and center the relational binds and interconnectedness of our life forms and of oceanic others. So a little overview of my presentation. I'm going to be discussing how Jonas centers empathy as a driving mechanism for the experiential knowledge production offered to the installation's spectators. My aim is to demonstrate how the installation constructs and performs an affective and speculative storytelling that seeks to reposition and reconfigure the relation of kinship between human and non-human waterbound beings. I will try to quickly move through 3 layers of analysis, attending to the role of empathy in the performativity of the installation's transferred performance gestures, the recited texts, and very briefly and lastly, the spatial configuration of the installation apparatus. A quick note on my use of the concept of performativity, which is informed by essays by Dorothea von Hantelmann and Shannon Jackson. Both of these authors work with conceptions of the term informed by the linguistic theory of the performative, which was proposed by philosopher of language, John L. Austin, in How to Do Things with Words in a lecture from 1962. And in his theory, Austin identifies as performative those speech utterances which have an act-like character, which produce an effect beyond the description of reality to produce reality, like the classic example of declaring 2 people to be wedded as spouses after they say, I do. So anyways, following von Hantelmann and Jackson, to analyze the performativity of an artwork implies asking how the meaning of the work is activated through its experience. Or in other words, attending to the performative signifies analyzing how the uptake of a work's experience by a viewer produces meaning in reality, while ultimately acknowledging the contingency of this situational and relational encounter. Again, rapidly, for those who may not be as familiar with Joan Jonas and her practice, she was among the first group of artists to experiment with early video technology in the 1970s, part of that sort of mythical group of downtown New York-based white middle-class Soho artists. But her early works often explore the formal qualities of video. She was an early buyer of the Sony Portapak in 1970, and often incorporated live video feedback into her performances, ultimately looking at ways that images are constructed. So you have an example of probably one of her more well-known performance works, organic honey's visual telepathy, the performative work, and then Vertical Roll, which shows organic honey performance documentation, but plays on the glitch of old television monitors where you could tune it and you would see the roll between the frames appear on screen. Just some context on Joan, Jonas, and her technological practices. And also a note that in her transition to shooting more digital works and incorporating more complex post-production, Jonas never really utilizes technology to produce special effects. And she's much more interested in finding ways to produce technological effects by hand. Other key themes that Jonas has engaged with throughout her career include ritualistic drawing practices, mythology, the metaphor of mirrors and mirroring. And in later performances, she plays with the performance in front of a video projection screen and is also very interested in citing different literary sources. So the Moving Off the Land project can be seen in continuity with these common themes, but it can specifically be placed within a cycle of ecologically minded works begun by Jonas around 2010 with Reanimation that you have here on the left. Both this project and Jonas's exhibition, They Come to Us Without a Word, for the American Pavilion at the 2015 Venice Biennale, engage with themes of mythology, but especially the precarity of ecosystems. And they anticipate many of the formal qualities that I will discuss in the Moving Off the Land works. So in Moving Off the Land, which is a 1 hour long performance presented on stage in front of an audience, Jonas reads excerpts of various texts at a lectern and alternately performs a series of gestures in front of the projection screen. This screen plays a montage of footage shot in aquariums around the world by the artist herself throughout the process of research for the pieces, and also incorporates underwater recordings shared with Jonas by David Gruber, who is a marine biologist and a collaborator on the project, having sustained conversations and exchanges with Jonas since 2017. As described by Tate Modern curator Andrea Lissoni, the Moving Off the Land lecture develops into a sort of ritual, concert, a dance, a drawing section, and a projected sequence in which the artist seems to mingle with underwater species such as fish, starfish, shrimp, and jellyfish. And I've just put some performance documentation on the screen to give you a feeling for this the performance iteration of the work. And in the installation, these performative gestures and the recited texts are transferred into the physical space through 5 video projections that interweave edited performance documentation with both the original projection footage from the performance, as well as newly shot video performance footage that Jonas created with a group of young collaborators in a studio in New York. And both the image and text sources for these pieces draw from a mixture of scientific and documentary sources on marine biology, as well as poetic and literary sources that engage with themes and mythologies of the oceans. So the nonlinear entanglement of these various sources leaves the work's narrative open-ended, and the experience of both the performance and the installation oscillate between lecture and poetry, inviting subjective interpretation of this elusive patchwork of text and imagery offered to the viewer. A very quick walkthrough of the exhibition space at Ocean Space in Venice, where the viewer is invited to navigate through the spatial environment, first encountering in the nave of the refurbished church. I don't know if I mentioned Ocean Space is in a refurbished 16th century church. In the nave, there's actually a recording of sperm whale communications by David Gruber that echoes in this large empty nave, and there's a line drawing of a whale by Jonas hanging from the altar. And then moving back into the choir space of the refurbished church, you find the bulk of the installation's components. There are a large number of fish drawings by Jonas hanging from the rafters, a selection of glass, Murano glass sculptures of mirrors to reflect the video images, as well as a little glass aquarium. And of course, the 5 video works that are embedded in the installation that viewers can step into as they're housed in these viewing box apparatuses that you see. So I'm going to focus here on the 5 video components of the installation, respectively titled Octopus, Mirror Pool, Jamaican Fisherman, Mermaid, and Whale. And here we can identify a primary and highly effective level of empathetic performativity in the performance gestures that are transferred to video. There we go. In Jonas's simple method of performing in front of, and therefore within, the video projections of the documentary footage of ocean life, she stages a speculative proximity and a relational encounter with the oceanic others that are projected onto her stage. And a recurring and highly evocative performance action consists of Jonas reacting to and interacting with the movements of the underwater creatures on the projection footage. Often her body language is inquisitive and her gestures are filled with care, as we can see on the left with the seal. But other times as well, it's a little bit more poetic and theatrical, where she'll use props to mirror and attempt to embody the persona of the marine vertebrates that are being projected onto her body. And I have a quick clip just to give you a better idea of the tone of the footage that she presents here. So for me, Jonas's actions seem to perform this desire to join into a submerged perspective of the other, an attempt to relate to the perspective and embody the experience, or at least mirror and perform the experience of the seal, as we see here, and the other creatures in other sections of the work. This desire to relate is evocatively reinforced by the video's textual layer, which in multiple passages recognizes fish's ability to feel and think in ways surprisingly close to our own experiences. And in this way, Jonas paints the ocean beings that she presents as subjects. And in one passage, for example, she recites a speculation by the animal ethologist Jonathan Balcombe, quoting, "Why do we know that some fish like to be pet? Because they ask for it. They appear to like the touch because they swim back to the hand repeatedly." So extending this staged proximity between Jonas, or alternately her young performers, and the projected images of marine vertebrates, the viewing box apparatuses create an impression of immersion and spatial relation between the viewer and the figures on film. And you have an image with viewers to give you a sense of the spatial relation on the screen. The viewing boxes also render Jonas's figure life-size. And I'll just go back to show how the performance documentation is cropped in a way that Jonas seems to be standing on the ground of the projection space, so in the same space as us. These viewing apparatuses are actually part of a series that Jonas has developed since the late 1990s, titled My New Theater, basically a portable video theater for the artist who can no longer perform as much as she would like to. That these boxes thus construct and create a sense in the viewer of sharing the space with the artist, as well as with the beings that she's interacting with from the force perspective in this space. So Jonas projects herself into a submerged worldview and takes us along with her in the simulated immersion of the video viewing boxes. So intertwined with these effective images and the installation's staged proximity, the driving mechanism for modeling empathy and moving off the land really primarily resides in Jonas's storytelling. And the grand nonlinear narrative presented in the moving off the land performance is re-edited for the exhibit for the installation into 5 chapters that unfold in the exhibition space. And the script, which is performed in the installation through video performances of young collaborators. There's never any footage of Jonas actually speaking in the installation. So this script is threaded together from a mixture of literary and poetry sources. So there's excerpts from Anna Akhmatova, Emily Dickinson, T.S. Eliot, also Moby Dick is in there, as well as scientific and naturalist writings by authors such as Jonathan Balcombe, Rachel Carson, Peter Godfrey Smith, and Cy Montgomery, who's The Soul of an Octopus I highly recommend as reading to relax, if ever anyone wants reading recommendations. So none of these literary sources are explicitly mentioned in the videos themselves or in the offered video transcripts with each video. The emphasis remains placed on an overall poetic storytelling rather than an academic lecture. And as you can see from the PowerPoint, the books are presented as a sort of further reading. So the sources are identified at the entrance of Ocean Space on the table close to where the exhibition pamphlets can be found. So though the experience of meaning production of the installation's videos remains highly subjective, as the visitors can encounter the chapters, the video chapters in any subjective order, the interwoven textual narrative can be read as representing or presenting rather a mythological storytelling of the common origins of human and sea animals. So I don't have time to take you through all of the narrative and all of the storytelling that's presented in the work because it's about 50 minutes long. But some quick examples in the mirror pool video. Jonas presents a collection of stories that highlight the common evolutionary and behavioral qualities of humans with marine vertebrates. So Jonas will tell us of how distant relatives of the whales once came onto the land, even developing feet before returning to the ocean's depths, while another of the young performers will explain to us how experiments have shown indications of self-consciousness in quite a few marine species, such as the giant manta rays. And in another video, the one titled Mermaid, Jonas offers an overview of the myth of the mermaid in different cultures, which leads her to conclude, quote, "We all come from the sea and we have memories of it in our minds and in our bodies." So this composed storytelling in Moving Off the Land figures the evolutionary, behavioral, and affective ties between human and ocean species. And this larger nonlinear narrative emphasizes the knowledge production of a new mythology of common origins and focuses on a recalibration of the subject-object relation humans hold with oceanic life forms. So in the composition and performance of Jonas's mythology of the sea, we can actually recognize an example, or I would like to recognize an example rather, of the type of sympoetic storytelling that feminist philosopher Donna Haraway advocates for in her book, Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in the Cthulhu Scene. For Haraway, this Cthulhu scene is a projected era of multi-species coexistence in which humans have learned to, quote, stay with the trouble of living and dying in responsibility on a damaged earth, end quote. So this speculative era that she speaks about doesn't aim to become a post-Anthropocene era, but rather posits the importance of learning with and becoming with other species, taking up responsibility and finding ways of letting life flourish within the irreparable damage already done to the planet. And for Haraway's storytelling and other practices of what she calls string figures are both examples of and a means to achieve symbiotic networks of coexistence and multi-species collaboration. So for me, the textual layer of Moving Off the Land can be seen as one such symbiotic, collectively constituted system, a sort of string figure of patterned voices constructed by Jonas that organizes anew the mythology of oceanic life and describes how humans share profound connections with these underwater species. The installation seems to model and enact a thinking with and making with, both through a collaboration with other writers and thinkers, and also an enacted collaboration with the ocean beings projected in the videos. So the work teaches about and encourages the recognition of interspecies interrelationship and interdependency. And in an evocative excerpt recited by one of the young performers in Mirror Pool, Moving Off the Land tells us that animals are always the observed. The fact that they can actually observe us has lost all significance. And I won't play the clip for you because I see my time slowly running out. But I'll just interpret it for you. The string figures drawn by Jonas in the installation seem to effectively offer the viewer the potential for reversing this anthropocentric relationship of observing an object and not treating it as if it has any agency. And the work models a new perspective on the shared origin, behaviors, and kinship of human and marine life forms. So through this overview of the performativity of the transferred gestures and the recited storytelling in Moving Off the Land, we can see how Jonas foregrounds empathy in her knowledge production of a mythology of the ocean. The interwoven images and texts encourage an identification and a relating with of how ocean beings think and feel. Jonas presents this other as a subject and frames poetically the relational binds that connect humans and these non-humans. We experience her storytelling of the common origin, diverging evolution, but ultimately of the shared present and entangled future that we share, and which for viewers will hopefully encourage and holds the potential to encourage a new sense of ethical responsibility towards ocean life. And as a means to conclude, I would like to quickly offer a note on the spatial iteration of the performativity in the installation. The situational experience of the space is really integral to the encouraged uptake of the storytelling. And it's really important to note that the immersive perspective of viewing boxes and the nonlinear, open-ended parcours of the works leads to a subjective engagement and a contingent uptake of the various threads woven by Jonas. The mechanisms of empathy in the installation depend on the situated partial perspective of the work taken up by each viewer to produce situated knowledge. So finally, as such, Jonas's performative iteration of empathy here is indebted both to the situated experience and physical presentness of the viewer, as much as it is produced through her simple yet evocative manipulations of video projection technology and her quoting and remixing of sources in her scripted storytelling. Thank you. I'll stop my screen share and hand it back to Serena.
Hi everyone, I'm not Serena, but I'm Kalina. Thanks so much. I'm the second presenter for this panel. Thanks so much, Allison, for those wonderful visuals. It was very therapeutic watching your presentation. I'm going to share my screen now and introduce myself. So hopefully everyone can see it. Hi, everyone. My name is Kalina Nedelcheva. I am calling in from Toronto right now, also known as Toronto. I'm in my first year as a graduate student in the Criticism and Curatorial Practice program at Concordia University. And given the circumstances in which we find ourselves today, I will be examining the potential of art galleries as spaces for radical acts of care. Artist-run centers like Elders Jerry and Joan Saddlebags, Jaja Chep Art and Tea House, as well as discursive programming initiatives such as No Looking After the Internet, which I will discuss later, show us how curatorial choices can facilitate the grounds of a community of understanding and acceptance. Jerry and Joanne do this by creating safe spaces for Indigenous knowledge and community, while No Looking facilitates this process through unlearning. By comparing the dynamics of pre-COVID art spaces to those of mutual aid projects, I make the case that the latent nature of independent art institutions as facilitators for community-led survival work. The municipal gallery in Diyarbakir, Turkey is a great example, as it actualized this potential in 2014 when it became a refugee camp for over 200 Yazidi refugees, which I'll talk about later as well. And somewhat unsurprisingly, mutual aid projects have proliferated during the current health crisis, offering support to the most vulnerable and exposing the shortcomings of government responses to the pandemic, which is why city officials usually don't like them so much. Mutual aid efforts work to, quote, meet people's survival needs and are based on a shared understanding that the conditions in which we are made to live in are unjust, unquote. In other words, they require one to harness empathy into action, from whence the first node between survival work and the art gallery manifests. Due to its similarities with interpersonal empathy, aesthetic empathy, which has become more accessible with the onset of participatory art, interactive media, and museums, can be utilized as a trajectory for strengthening awareness and motivating action to contribute to social movements that support vulnerable communities. This main obstacle here is the digital environment and structures like the charity model, which are built to demobilize publics. This will be demonstrated in this paper by Apio to W.J. Mitchell's Economy of Presence and artist Hiro Stero's complementary notion of junk time. Before I continue, I would like to establish a more concrete connection between interpersonal and aesthetic empathy. The first kind refers to being able to understand another's perspective and to have an emotional response to it. Many of us know exactly what that feels like. And in art history, aesthetic empathy is a projection of movement, bodily feeling, and even the self into the object of aesthetic appreciation. It considers the questions of how we experience works of art as animated and affective. And the concept is derived from the German term Einfühlung, first coined by aesthetician Robert Fischer in 1873. Despite their differences, one being concerned with human beings and the other with human artifacts, the two types of empathy have many similarities, including their roots in perspective taking, the embodiment of that perspective, and its affective qualities. This permits the two variants to complement and even reinforce one another in social contexts, which is well displayed in school curriculums that rely on art to teach and strengthen empathy in children. The educational potential of the aesthetic interpersonal relation is harder to realize in the gallery setting, but not impossible. This is the result of the residue of eliticism and colonial values that define the historic origins of the museum today. While institutional critique and progressive staff work toward accessibility and better distribution of resources, artist-run centers and independent galleries prove to be more flexible by supporting diverse public with practices of care and exercises in self-reflexivity. It is under the condition of discursive programming that the process of community building in art spaces resemble the ethical code of mutual aid groups. The word resembles here, I would like to note that it stresses similarity, but in no way suggests sameness. A longer paper would consider the logistical limitations of such an endeavor, but here I elaborate on the logical similarities. Organizing and maintaining a collective mentality, void of hierarchy of opinion, is an important part of successful groups. As such, developing interpersonal empathy is a paramount condition. for mutual aid. In mutual aid, building new solidarities during this crisis and the next, as I'm sure many of you have seen this book cover by now. If not, it's a great book. Dean Spade identifies the best practices for starting and maintaining community-based support networks. He stresses the importance of working together and sharing knowledge to build solidarities across differences in experience. This includes continuously reflecting on group culture and leadership, exercising compassion, and being wary about implications tied to external collaborations. For instance, consensus decision-making is advised. This is an approach that encourages generative conflict and is committed to finding solutions that are supported or accepted by everyone. Such an exercise calls for heightened self-reflexivity and empathetic awareness of other perspectives. Not looking after the internet, which is exhibited in these photographs, is facilitated by curators Gabriel Moser and Kim Simon. It engages participants in similar ways. The educational program is, quote, looking group, unquote, that discusses decontextualized images of difficult knowledge. At the first meeting, the cohort talked about artist Deanna Bowen's research for Invisible Empires, which was an exhibition in 2013, and these are some of the photographs from it. And as the curator and artist explored the historic presence of the Ku Klux Klan in Canada. Gabriel Moser works to encourage people to think about what they're seeing as they're looking, while being self-reflexive about what is happening in the group. What are people talking about and what are they not talking about? Aside from the focus on group dynamics, understanding and commitment to growth, as well as perspective sharing, No Looking also highlights a style of guidance that complements its intentions. Divergent from the colonial patriarchal understanding of leader, the curators attempt at facilitating leaderless and leaderful groups complement the skills needed for productive community assistance efforts and overall activist works. It also kind of mirrors consensus decision-making. Aside from relying on interpersonal connection and perspective sharing, mutual aid is also rooted in survival work and has proven to be central as crisis support for underserved communities. One such crisis occurred on August 3rd, 2014, when the Islamic State launched a coordinated attack across the Sinjar region in northern Iraq, homeland to Yazidi ethno-religious minority. Many were killed or abducted, while 250,000 fled to Mount Sinjar, where they spent days enduring extreme hot temperatures with little access to food, water, or medical care. On August 7, 2014, an international coalition sought to help the stranded civilian population. In the following days, around 100,000 Yazidi refugees fled, finding shelter in refugee camps in Rojava, which is in northern Syria, northern Iraq, and Turkey's Kurdish regions. It is on this occasion that the city of Diyarbakir opened its municipal gallery, pictured here, both interior and outside, as an emergency shelter. In light of mutual aid being government independent, the conversion of Diyarbakir's gallery into refugee camp cannot be identified as a pure example of this type of survival work, but in its capacity as aid, the gallery reinforces the versatility of its space. It admits that it can handle not only an exhibition turnover, but also the urgent needs of vulnerable individuals. And they find this photograph here of the curator desk left empty, very, very powerful. Another example of utilizing space, Another example of utilizing space as a resource is Jerry and Joanne Saddleback's Nedelcheva Art and Tea House in Edmonton, which unfortunately had to close its doors due to the pandemic. Here I have a short video, just to kind of give an understanding of what it actually looks like or sounds like. It's very divergent from the white Cuba aesthetic. With the focus on cultivating meaning and self-determined gatherings with roots and intentionality in indigenous approaches, the center hosted exhibitions, bowl-making workshop, Cree language classes, and more. In an interview with C Magazine, Joanne Saddleback quantifies it as a space where, quote, you come and eat, you come and drink, you come and visit, unquote. In the same conversation, the elders shared that they gave other artists and artisans a space to work, helping out creatives with limited access to studio from their own community. While the Municipal Gallery of Diyarbakir was utilized to assist in an intense and costly humanitarian crisis, Jerry and Joan Saddleback's art practice created indigenous systems of care, generosity, and understanding through art and making as a catalyst. At its best, mutual aid relies on similar structures to harness empathy and produce social awareness where people grow new solidarities. The potential of harnessing aesthetic empathy to strengthen interpersonal understanding is made harder in the context of COVID-19, as gallery attendance is substituted with solitary and sanitary visits. Many institutions have moved to online programming, relying on technology to maintain public connection and support artists. Meanwhile, the Canadian response still leaves much to be desired. In combination with existing anti-racism protests, movements like the Land Back movement and the housing crisis, the situation necessitates community-based action where mutual aid becomes a radical act in the face of isolation and forced dependency. Provincial governments have failed to meet the needs of the most vulnerable by imposing curfews, enabling evictions, and offering shelters that are almost indistinguishable from confinement facilities. In Toronto, mutual aid groups like the Encampment Support Network and Community Fridges work to ensure that at-risk populations survive the winter and the pandemic on humane terms, despite the city's efforts to delegitimize and criminalize their activity. Many independent and artist-run centers have made posts on social media and signed petitions expressing their support for such activities and critiquing the government. Although such sentiments are necessary and help with spreading the word, it is important to mobilize individuals, businesses, and institutions in a physical sense and with physical resources when possible. Realizing the limitations of democratic public sphere in the digital environment allows for the critical separation from system complacency that is reinforced by online presence, as well as charity and relief models, which are a way for upper classes and governments to make decisions on who gets help and what strings are attached. Technology is essentially a product of capitalism and colonialism. It facilitates structures that dispute how people have historically connected and by extension empathize with one another. In its capacity as a platform, the internet is the enabler of efficiency and convenience, creating an unlimited quantity of artificial propinquity, that's a fancy word for nearness, which result in instantaneous and cost-effective connections between people and ideas. In 1998, art historian William J. Mitchell described this as, quote, a new economy of presence that is characterized by an enhanced market for attention, time, and movement. The theory implies that the scarcest resources in the age of reproducibility are human attention and presence. Presence here is understood as, quote, the promise of unmediated communication, the glow of uninhabited existence, unseemingly unalienated experience, and authentic encounter between humans. As technology makes remote and even simultaneous presence possible through the availability of various communication and management tools, being physically present becomes an act of investment. Thus, in spending increased amounts of time online, we continuously reinvest a very scarce resource into the tool that was essentially designed to free us from spatial and temporal constraints. Artist and filmmaker Hito Stereo built on Mitchell's work by introducing the notion of junk time in her book Duty-Free Art, Art in the Age of Planetary Civil War. She defined the concept as a, quote, temporal infrastructure that consists of fractured schedules and dysfunctional collapsing just-in-time economies in which people frantically try to figure out reverberating asynchronicities and the continuous breakdown of riffraff timetables. Very poetic. As such, junk time turns out to be discontinuous and broken, omnipresent, and running on several parallel tracks. For Stereo, investing in junk time means to invest rather perpetually in the Heideggerian notion of Dasein. This is translated from German as, quote, being there, unquote, and proposed as the distinctive mode of being as realized by humans. Another way of expressing this sentiment is considering how the internet necessitates the always-on culture, which in turn is rooted in different forms of social competitiveness and fears of missing out. Presence, however, is always singular, and that's the key. You cannot be continuously conscious of your physical self in your online extension. That is, it is only when we turn away from the screen to look at the window that we remember we are sitting in our home and it is raining outside. Attention, like presence, is also a finite resource. According to Sterol, we need to stand in or a proxy to deal with the digital demand of junk time, or, quote, the terror of total Dasein, unquote, as she puts it, because we're incapable of meeting the demands of technology. During the COVID-19 pandemic, many of us are forced to attend school and do our work online, depend on video conferencing software to socialize and access entertainment through streaming services. In other words, we are pushed to embody our proxy to the fullest extent. And since mutual aid groups rely on concrete action, our passivity make its manifestation, let alone its function, less probable. As we become less engaged in our physical communities, those in a position to help others allow technology to overshadow ground action and are satisfied with short-lived victories. In her analysis of social media and internet activism, Therese Francis Tierney stipulates that, quote, a tension between Habermasian ideals of democratic publics and a Foucauldian observation of biopolitics and surveillance emerge in online environments, rendering these audiences technologically dependent and thereby unstable. The routine practices of data mining, government intelligence, and control, in combination with the general inaccessibility of the platform, this includes both not having access to a computer or device, forbid the formations of any sort of online public sphere where individuals can come together and freely discuss societal problems and influence political action. Instead, what we are left with is a privatized public. Prior to COVID-19, galleries relied on physical attendance to fill seats and to create spaces where empathy, interaction, and collective growth were possible, as I've exemplified above. Many have since pivoted to online programming and are experiencing a problem of atmosphere, which is essentially a combination of individual presences, therefore kind of relates to the idea of a presence being singular and irreplaceable. And these art institutions embodied their online proxies during the pandemic, just as a person would. The connection between aesthetic empathy and interpersonal empathy, however, becomes disrupted in the chaos of junk time. This is a screenshot from Stuart Marshall's documentary Bright Eyes, 1984. Stuart Marshall is a Canadian filmmaker and AIDS activist. And this is his film was part of Picturing a Pandemic, which is a series of screening texts and discussions that ran from April 2020 to November 2020. It showed us how online disengagement encounters productive growth. By reinforcing the formal connections between the resilience of vulnerable communities and their historic use of video as a tool for staging liberations, the content and presentation of this program vouches for the still existing potential of countercultural establishments as purveyors of education rooted in self-reflexivity, even in the online age. Grounded in activisms of care and radical practices, Picturing a Pandemic essentially showed videos from the 60s, 70s, 80s countercultural movements and just kind of how activists helped communities, and communities faced labor laws and racism and sexism and so on. The absence of direct community engagement, however, with regards to the program, whether it was the result of funding issue or a curatorial decision, posed a major challenge for practical actualization or for healing. The intended shift from emergency to urgency culture remained a passive gesture in the long run, as audiences outside of activist organizing remain isolated from one another, or worse, felt unable to mobilize their empathy due to the ambiguity and implied distance of technological communication. In this light, goals like community compassion or the urgency perspective become much harder to achieve. While activists and mutual aid group use the internet to expand reach, online exclusive activism on the individual level is a proxy of our commitment to an equal and anti-racist society. In reinvesting the potential of our physicality back into the cybersphere, we subscribe to the privatized notion of the public, which is the antithesis of what mutual aid is seeking to build. Thus, resisting the obsolete embodiment of our proxies, which are fragmented in junk time, and overcoming limitations of presence or atmosphere are some of the serious challenges in the digital economy. The likeness between radical curating and mutual aid network communicate possibilities of active care, education, and perspective sharing and compassion that are not only paramount for community survival during crises, but also in change making. As such, they are worth considering and engaging with. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, even just send them in the Q&A, or if you think of something after the presentation, feel free to shoot me an email. Thank you so much.
Okay, hello everyone. I hope everyone is seeing my presentation all right and hearing me well. Amazing presentations before me, and I cannot be now less nervous. So I hope I do as well as the people presenting with me. Hello everyone. I am delighted to be joining you all today. Thank you so much for having me. I am Nicole Mcgregor, a Communication and Culture Master student at Ryerson University, and I will be presenting my exploratory research on the prospects of using volumetric filmmaking in documentary media. The relationship between the film and the viewer has been scrutinized since the origins of the medium. Deleuze's theories arouse with new engagement methods, with expanded cinema pieces exploiting the senses through manipulated visuals and augmented acoustics. Challenged by creating films that will linger in the minds and the bodies of the viewers, expanded cinema filmmakers have experimented with immersive strategies to reach complex mental engagement levels, inviting the viewer nearly physically into the events projecting on the screens. For this purpose, they use techniques that range from alteration of the moving image, playing with the medium's visual properties like quality, light, and texture, to the use of parallax and visual multidimensionality. To achieve these effects, filmmakers make creative use of the medium to bring new experiences to their audiences. And now, with the ever-changing media ecology, they are not bound to a visual two-dimensional space. Volumetric video involves using an infrared camera to create a 3D mesh of a scene. In regards, volumetric filmmaking offers it offers additional properties that allows for exploration in a 3D realm. It holds several unique properties with untapped potential because of how it captures the subject's depth. Volumetric capture provides the data and tools required for the deconstruction and manipulation of the image captured. Thanks to the fast development of virtual reality and augmented reality, we currently observe volumetric video as the next significant evolution of media production. The entry cost of VR has lowered significantly as all-in-one headsets, which do not require like an incredibly powerful computer to run, made it to the market. Meanwhile, most modern phones are now capable of providing users with an exciting AR experience. When it comes to volumetric filmmaking production, it was not until the arrival of technologies like Depth Kit, like a 2.5D volumetric capture tool in 2019, that volumetric capture became actually accessible. This entry cost reduction has allowed for the exploration on independent documentary production. As prices lower for both production and consumption of volumetric cinema, filmmakers will be allowed to offer a myriad of experiences to their audiences. Film researchers have converged on examining haptic cinematography and cinema's affect to question how the viewer can experience. Sorry, I was let know that my image froze. Is everything okay? No? Okay.
No, it's still frozen.
It will continue. Sorry about that. Film researchers have converged on examining haptic cinematography and cinema's affect to question how the viewer can experience physical sensations through audiovisual experimentation. In this context, the study of volumetric video used in documentary media is a new stage in this inquiring trajectory. especially now that it has been acknowledged as an empathy machine. Previous work in volumetric filmmaking has leveraged its potential to create compelling human experiences. Volumetric video offers novel possibilities for perceptual and emotional identity between the viewer and the subject. Chris Milk 2015 TED Talk presented VR as the ultimate empathy machine. Volumetric images exist in a virtual space and possess a dynamic set of properties to apply and develop expanded cinema strategies to achieve affective experiences and haptic visuality. This presentation will provide a revision of how to approach volumetric video to achieve hyper-experiential documentaries that incite empathy. Carlos. Sorry, I will reset my presentation because it's frozen. Sorry about that. I will reset.
Okay. You can stop sharing and then just reshare it.
Thank you.
No problem.
Engagement. Do you see my subtitles running or not?
Right now, we just see that you started sharing your screen, but the actual image doesn't appear.
Okay. Thank you. My computer froze. Engagement.
Oh, there's no.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. Take your time. Okay, we see everything.
Okay, thank you so much. And sorry for the technology freezing happening. Okay, thank you so much. Engagement. The preoccupation with sensorial engagement is why expanded cinema filmmaking is affiliated with the studies of the affect, a phenomenological modality that connects humanities, social sciences, and neuroscience. The affect has played a core role in the way filmmakers tell stories through cinema, approaching the digital form and letting it act as a process that liberates affectivity from perception. Volumetric video offers compelling opportunities for artists when approaching the affect in documentary media. The development of the study on affect allows us to study film experiences as participative associations. Laura Marks expands on the effects of the affect as a cinema-produced set of emotions that place the viewer as an active agent who influences any possible set of experiences, drawing upon their own subjective resources. The moving image in the screen or virtual space are registered by the audience as corporeal experiences because of their bi-directional relationship. We can find some strategies to convey emotion and increase the cinematic experience on the research on affect. Since volumetric video shares many of its characteristics with 3D films, I want to correlate some of their properties. Since the three-dimensional film's resurgence, it has resurgence has updated the media context, relating its spatial depth to properties to the desire of observing as an understanding. The negative parallax of the three-dimensional films responds to emergent images, producing somatic and emotional responses in the viewer. In contrast, the positive parallax encourages what Kristen Wiesel can call the curious look, to see in order to know. Depth and emergence drive the viewer's mind into the film screen as affective and epistemic forms of perception, achievable by the stereoscopic image's hyperhaptic quality. However, 3D films abide by sharpness and evidence. When exploring the time-image relationship, Laura Marks expands on the haptic vision and haptic perception concepts. Haptic vision relates to presenting the viewer uncliched images that are so thin that the spectator has to bring out their memory resources to make those images consistent. Haptic perception is the combination of tactile and kinesthetic functions, how we experience touch on the surface and the inside of our bodies. Our eyes work as an extension of other organs, drawing from known senses towards a multisensorial experience. Haptic look rests on the surface, distinguishing itself as no more than a texture. Grainy and dispersed facades are the ones that invite a haptic look, a look that uses the eye as an organ of touch. In this context, we can position volumetric video in a new category, separate from 3D cinema. It embraces 3D cinema's dimensional properties, but the images can be manipulated to be grainy and show dispersion on multiple planes. Kiasulankinen et al. In their study Haptic Context of a movie dynamically engage the spectator's sensory motor cortex, reveal how brain imaging shows that observing another person's emotion and actions activate brain areas that support similar functions in the viewer. Their study concluded that when someone watches haptic events, they modulate their sensory motor cortex and it engaged dynamically to what they are observing. Volumetric filmmaking presents itself as a hyper-haptic tool. It could signify a new way of communicating and understanding each other by building an empathic connection between the spectator and the story. Volumetric images in stereoscopic environments have hyper-haptic qualities that call for a reconfiguration of how we relate with the screen space. Screen or the space. They allow us to alternate between the realms of identification and tactile observation. About the aesthetic qualities of 3D imagery, it works as an immersive sensory experience that heightens emotion. With this approach, identification becomes an exercise that relates to the topic of identity. Some extended thoughts. In her article, The Immersive Turn, Hype and Hope in the Emergence of Virtual Reality as a Non-Fiction Platform, Mandy Rose engages critically with the use of virtual reality for documentary production. She expresses how discourse of empathy around VR is founded on several questionable assumptions. One of them is the idea that an empathic response arises from standing virtually in another person's shoes. This idea does not recognize the need for physically experiencing physical states to understand a person's condition. Additionally, Rose points out the illusion of unmediated access that the spectator has to the world depicted. While this is an issue that can awake in any documentary, regardless of the shape it takes, the fake proximity offered by the virtual reality experience suppresses the distance required for a critical response. As with every new media technology, we have to be critical of how it influences and mediate our interactions. In the case of documentaries, our relationship with the subject is essential. New sensory experiences call for new types of narrative in film and film strategies. The them as narrative is prevalent in many traditional documentaries, which hurts humanity's relationship in the long run. It will be interesting to achieve stories that build upon honest empathy, which moves away from the them as narrative towards the us perspective. Moving forward, this analysis is part of my research creation project. We will use phenomenology and media ecology to study the production of volumetric documentary, in the production of a volumetric documentary about building a Canadian identity as a first-generation citizen. The documentary focuses on South American immigrants' experiences and how they sustain their two new identities, Canadian and Latinx. Sarah Ahmeds described immigration as a process that involves reorienting ourselves. Being lost is part of that process where the unfamiliar finally becomes familiar. Previous research suggests that expanded cinema strategies using volumetric filmmaking can recreate this process. We will use volumetric capture to construct and deconstruct the stories of Latinx immigrants. Additionally, we will use the virtual space as the place where the viewer has to orient themselves and find themselves. This capture method has the potential to engage the body in strong empathetic emotions. This approach will offer a new venue to build identification and transform spectatorship into an active engagement that will foster empathy. Accordingly, this approach will expose identity through content and form, having volumetric video as an identification process of bodies in the virtual space. This documentary attempts to build a novel experiential system that relies on perception and images, ultimately bringing viewers closer to empathy. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Nicole, and all the other panelists who presented. I really enjoyed listening to your presentations. I have a few questions that I've written myself, and I'm going to keep an eye on the chat to see all the other questions coming in as well. My first question that I came up with is for all of you. In listening to you talk all in your presentations, I noticed that you mentioned a presence of the body in various abstract manners, whether it was referencing gestural restrictions or kinships that occurs by corporeally navigating space, or technology that resonates haptically in the body. And I was wondering if you could all elaborate on this potential link of embodiment and empathy that is brought forward through the technological interactions you describe. I don't know who wants to go first, but you can all take your time.
You can go first. So just making sure, like, if I start straying away from your question, just making sure it's staying on track. But so basically, I speak about the body, I feel, in two major points in my presentation. One is explaining aesthetic empathy, because it is many historians, art historians specifically, have considered the importance of the body within the exhibition space as a receiver of aesthetic appreciation. I forget the name of the author who I read this in passing to by, but they mentioned that, the way we look at sculpture, and let's say you're looking at a Rodin, and you're unconsciously might be mimicking the posture or the structure of that you're seeing, and it is in the acts of you moving your body to take a closer look or take a view from below or above are also connected to the emotional experience of the work. So it's kind of like this cohesion. And the second time I talk about the body is actually the lack of the body, which is within the presence and the economies of presence and such. And I think that absolutely the body is so important within the ability to embody empathy, because you recognize yourself in the other person. And a lot of online on Zoom, I don't know people, I can't see people's body language, and I can't make an accurate, I can't comfortably make an accurate judgment about how they're feeling or what they're doing. And the other part is that, the public sphere, which I mentioned, I don't elaborate much on it because of the length of the paper, but the Habermas public sphere is the idea of a space where people gather and kind of engage in social discourse about social problems or political action and so on. But that's impossible in online, because not everyone has access to a computer. In the public sphere as such, everyone needs to have equal access to it. And then there's like also the arbitrariness and the intensity of having everything, time is like loosely defined in the digital space. So yes.
No, that was great. And I remembered when I was reading your proposal before your presentation, I really thought it was interesting how you pulled on the restriction and the enablement of both aspects. I don't know if anyone else has anything to say about that aspect.
I don't know, it was interesting for me. Actually, I'm quite happy to have been put in the panel that focuses on more technological iterations of empathy, because in the works that I study for my master's, keeping my cat away, I focus more. I really focus on the concept of performativity. Oh, I shouldn't have opened the door. So I really focus, like, have a methodological focus on performativity and looking at how physical presence and the experience of a space creates knowledge production. And so when I was rewriting for today, I was like, okay, what does Joan do? That's like, how do I link the tech? How is this linked to the performance? So it's interesting to think about it. And this is not a fully formed thought, but thinking about how technology for Joan's works helps to extend her performative actions, create, like, plays with perspectives to sort of create a more immersive performative action, and then also use technological tools to transfer that, like, liveness of performance into an installation space. But it's hard to think about because she doesn't really engage with more digital technologies where there's these questions. So I'm trying to, like, retroactively apply questions of, like, alienation and the online world, and I don't think it quite applies to the performance the installation I talked about today. But yeah, but the questions of mediation as well, like whether it's technology, whatever the interface is between a community and an institution, or an artist and their public. And it's interesting to think about these interfaces and how what's lost and what's gained in this mediation of a relation of empathy. I don't know if that answers.
I wanted to actually listen to the other panelists before jumping on, because I am a highly biased person. I adore technology, and you can see because of my presentation, I am so excited about everything that is coming up. And the point of accessibility, I also do it, like when I serve the word accessibility, like that is available to people. I am actually not saying to everyone. It's more like if you're already producing something, it will be, instead of 100K, it will be like 1K kind of production. Of course, that is not accessible to everyone. The same with like virtual reality headsets. Yet I find that like there could be spaces as I do think that internet is a human right, because it's a access to information, and everybody, regardless of their background condition, should have access to it. I think that there should be spaces that facilitate this kind of experiences and connections that don't have like that wall, like economical wall. Also, of course, being critical of what technology brings with it. It's a mediation. It's like it, as much as it brings exciting things, it also takes away from connection. So it connects us and it takes away. So like, yeah, those are my thoughts. That is basically that I am biased, but kind of critical at the same time.
I agree with you, Nicole, in saying that I was recently having a conversation about how internet should be more accessible just as a space of learning. And yeah, I understand completely what you mean. I have a very big excitement about that. And in your presentation, it was actually the first time I learned about volumetric cinema, but I had read about haptic visuals in cinema before. So it was really interesting to see that. And I actually had a question for you specifically in regards to that. I was wondering if, because I don't believe I've ever seen volumetric cinema, is it something that's typically in like films, or is it more in like an installation setting that it's seen?
Well, it actually can be in both spaces. Even the projection of volumetric video recordings are, they have another texture to it, because you're playing with, like, you can do a lot of work with it. But there have been a couple of documentaries that are specific with volumetric cinema that I know of. Probably there are many more. There is one about access to abortion. Access to abortion. That is one of the images that I brought to the screen. The name of that film is That Choice in 2020. And yeah, like they are using actually really interesting volumetric filmmaking. But like the ones that do not excite me that much are the ones that use volumetric filmmaking as precise image, like precise reality into the 3D space. I do not understand why people do that. I am excited about what you can do with it. How can you bring all these concepts that you know of, like haptic touch and like affect, bring them into like the shapes and the forms of the three-dimensional space. And yes, they can be also projected on a two-dimensional screen, and they carry that feeling. That's why I'm so excited, because I have seen it. Like it actually touches like my soul.
That is really exciting. I'm going to look into watching it after, because I really want to see how that works in person and stuff. I was going to also say, with regards to what Allison had mentioned in regards to the installation, I think also in looking at the video you presented, I thought of the installation, I thought it was really interesting with the movements and the setup of people sitting in this box from floor to ceiling with it. I felt like it was almost inviting for the spectators to kind of like feel like they were immersed in the space as well with their body. And I just wanted to take note of that. I have one more question that I wrote for you, and then I'm gonna look and see if there's anything in the Q&A. I noticed that both Allison and Kalina pulled out strands on on social justice in their presentation, whether referencing to sharing the perspectives and cultures of people who species who have been othered, I should say. I'm sorry. And I was wondering if, despite the disruption of technology that you guys have felt, if you think that this social justice element has been more feasible when enabled through technology, despite like the fact that you're not directly coming into contact with people and having the physicality of someone being present.
Kalina, is it okay if I go first? Did you want to? Yeah, okay. I'm actually really happy that Kalina presented right after me, because it is a question I asked myself about the piece, even when I was just applying to the symposium. The moving off the land, both the performance and the installation are works that I personally enjoy and admire, but I also completely acknowledge that these are works that are shown, in major international museums as part of biennales. There's questions of access and like a spectacular element to the works, and was thinking as well about ocean space, or rethinking about ocean space as an institution. Kalina, sort of prompted by some of the subjects you brought up. And I think a practice like Joan's, and a works like Joan, stays on this level of like potential speculation. It really depends on who is, how much time, presence, engagement a visitor is dedicating to the work, and also if they're primed or not. I was a vegetarian before I saw the work, so it like spoke to me, and I had been reading Donna Haraway, so I'm like, wow, I love this, and I interpreted it on a level that other people without, certain experiences or thought processes wouldn't also connect with. So I think, you know, have to acknowledge that an installation like Moving Off the Land stays on the level of potentiality that can and needs to be completed by community engagement and activism, which interestingly, Joan addresses much more directly in her performance. There's a lot of passages in her performance where she's like explicitly anti-speciesist, talks about the importance of reducing overfishing and, you know, what we can do to help you know, heal some of the abusive industries, overfishing, etc. But those aren't as present in the installation. Those clips are like edited out. Probably also for the context. I mean, if the artist is present in a space, there's a more direct engagement in the context of her performance. So that might explain why the more activist, you know, advocacy takes place in that context of direct contact. But yeah, it has to be, the sort of practices have to be completed and accompanied by institutions that aren't just appropriating something for the sake of or tokenizing these kind of practices, but actually also offer you know, community programs and workshops, which is something that Ocean Space does, but also as a space funded by a giant international, you know, commissioning machine that is the Thyssen-Bornemisza Foundation. There are critiques to be made of the space and of Jonas's practice and the limits of it in engaging empathy.
Yeah, Allison, I'm also really glad that your presentation was before mine, because you just put forth Ocean Space, this amazing, like really magnanimous from the pictures exhibition that really felt like if you were there, it will be just very emotional experience, especially since we find ourselves in a world that's like increasingly, you know, under pressure from consequences of climate change. I completely agree. Institutions always, I find art institutions, museums, any kind of institutions, there's always strings attached. I have had class speakers, I've talked to curators for minority groups specifically, who have, you know, very much revealed some of the things that they've had to put up with or negotiate. And there are just very slight interests that not everyone has the time, the skills, or the resources to investigate. I do think that the reason why I speak solely about independent and artist-run centers in my presentation was exactly because of that, because those are more contained and those are usually not under pressure from really big donors who are, you know, in the private sector. And I really felt that spaces like that can facilitate gatherings. And I think if we're talking about anti-racist work, if we're talking about decolonialism, these conversations, I personally don't think that any part of them should be happening online unless it's like absolutely necessary. I think that will be much more productive, personally, if they were in place, in person gathering, because there is a lot of feelings and emotions to be unpacked that, you know, for me, is, you know, almost impossible to do online. But I also think that technology does offer, so echoing Nicole, it does offer a really huge potential in terms of organizing and educating to that degree, because it makes information accessible. It has a certain democratic character that is sometimes overshadowed by surveillance and tools that, you know, but in a place. Yeah, so I think it's a great tool for like getting information out there and mobilizing, but for having those conversations person to person, we shouldn't be having them online, and we should be having them in person. And great spaces to have them in person are galleries that have seemingly no strings attached, like the Jajaj Art and Tea House, you know, focused on indigenous communities, was a great example for me. I showed the video because there was like loud music, which certainly wouldn't be heard in the traditional gallery setting. It was kind of like messy, but people were coming in, they were gathering, and they were just being with each other. So yeah, I think that's why gallery spaces have that. It just has to, you know, be freed from the from the restraints.
Yes, I definitely agree. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists. I think you guys offered a lot of really thoughtful opinions that I'm going to continue to think about for a while. And thank you to everybody who tuned in to listen to the panel today. I really appreciate you all coming to look.
Can I ask a question? Can I ask a quick question
Yeah.
to Nikole? I'm like very, very intrigued because I'm also really interested in documentary practices. Nikole, are there any platforms where we can see your work specifically, or your documentaries? I'd be really, really interested if stuff is out and accessible in the digital space while we can't actually go to a gallery space until hopefully a couple more months.
That is super like kind of you to ask. I have short films. I only have like a really short volumetric film that I actually did in 2017. I will share my website here. But yeah, my project, I will put it on my website when I have it, because I'm doing this research creation, like volumetric filmmaking project that I hope that it gets to translate on my research and my ideas. But thank you. I'll share with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, all of you, for presenting and sharing today. Like every other session so far, I come out inspired, refreshed, and ready to kind of delve into more research and art and everything. So thank you all for being here, as well as the attendees. These sessions wouldn't be possible without your support, so thank you for tuning in. If you wish to attend our closing keynote, which is at 5 o'clock tonight, you can register via the link in our Instagram bio, which is at AHGSA Concordia. And you can also see the link to our virtual vitrine exhibition on the same theme, empathy, as well in that bio. Thank you, Serena, for moderating, and I will close the session, and I hope to see you all at 5 p.m. Thank you. Bye.